Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on this freezing cold evening, but we're all warm inside and you're ready for a really colorful presentation. That's enough of my dumb jokes for the night. My name's Gretchen Harnick, and I'm with Parsons and the School of Fashion. I'm an assistant professor in our fashion marketing program, and we're really excited to continue our relationship with WGSN in co-producing this panel. We also have an in-class competition that we run with WGSN in our trend spotting class, and one of the panel members actually has delivered a trend forecasting presentation to our students every semester. So it's a really wonderful partnership that we've developed over the years. I wanted to point out one unique aspect of the event this evening, and that's the two tables in front of you here on stage. I happened to meet two product design students last week. They're sophomore students, and they built and constructed and designed these are Parsons tables. And the two students' names are Laszlo Thorson Nagel and Kasia Yoon. And they've really put their own unique spin on the classic Parsons table in a sophomore level class. So I really wanted to thank them and congratulate them and all of our students as we're going through finals week. So there's a lot of pressure here, and we really hope that all our students have a wonderful break. So thanks again for coming. Now on to the event. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Allyson Rees. She's been with WGSN for over 3 years, and she's currently the retail editor responsible for East Coast retail news and analysis, city guides, art reviews, and New York catwalk coverage. She also covers Fashion Week coverage abroad at Fashion Rio, International Designers Mexico, and Columbia Moda. Allyson contributes analysis for WGSN's trade shows, news, juniors, celebrity style, and business resource directories. So, without further ado, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. My name is Allyson Rees, and I'm WGSN's East Coast retail editor. I'm also your moderator tonight, and the title of this panel is The Relationship Between Color and Trends. As many of you know, last week Pantone announced honeysuckle as its color of the year for 2011, and it's a great opportunity right now to talk about color and fashion trends, but also we're going to talk a lot about the cultural and societal temperatures that bring about these trends. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the panel tonight. We have Lisa Herbert, who's the Vice President of Pantone Fashion, Home and Consumer. Chris Benz, award-winning women's wear designer. Vilislava Petrova, who is WGSN's trend editor and U.S. color specialist. And Stephen Faerm, who's the director of BFA Fashion at Parsons The New School for Design. So to start out, I just wanted to ask each of you why you think as a society we're affected by color. Why is color important to us? If you want to go ahead.
First?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in terms of us being affected by color, it really starts when we're little babies and our perceptions of color are very deep-rooted. So it may be colors that we see, the cars that our parents are driving, the colors in our kitchen. I had a yellow kitchen, and that always remains very happy and a wonderful color for us. So, it's not something that happens later on, but we begin to develop our perceptions and our feelings about color very early on in our life based on some of our experiences.
And Chris, would you like to add anything?
I mean, for me, I feel like I say it all the time, but I grew up in Seattle where it's gray and miserable all the time. And, at least for me growing up, color really meant something because it was always gray. There were always clouds. And on a beautiful sunny day, it was like the greenest trees, like the most gorgeous blue sky. And I feel like I grew up with that sort of appreciation, like you said, from childhood where, color was something that I was had this very strong emotional connection to. So I think you know, in my design career now, I sort of reflect on that and probably have those same sorts of relationships with certain colors.
Billy?
As Lisa said, memories are actually a driving factor of color in society. And another aspect is emotions. We have a very strong emotional connection to certain colors. We use color to celebrate. When people are getting married in the Western society, they wear white. When in Asia, for example, a bride is about to get married, she wears red. So we all have different perception of color based on emotion. I think the reason why color is so important now in society is because we perceive newness by color. For us, something speaks new and excitement based on its color. Whether we're talking about fashion or a product, we could be delivered the exact same product, just in different packaging on different color, and we'll perceive it as new.
I think it's very similar to, excuse me, for me, in that it's such a primal and emotional component to our lives, and it can often dictate what we do or don't do in our lives. I think of a funny story of the art room in my high school where in the 60s it was painted bright red and the office adjacent to it was purple. So these, I'll never forget the teacher talking about how the students would be banging and hammering and being really frenetic and destroying the art room, and then they'd be pulled into the office to be yelled at, and it was purple and small, and they just kind of changed their mood. And even, you know, how many times have we gone into a restaurant or a public space, and just by going into that space, not only the scale, but also the colors and how it makes you feel. And again, how you feel determines oftentimes what you do or don't do, choices you make.
So moving on to how it affects the consumer, with the announcement of honeysuckle last week, I want to talk a bit about how a new color gets introduced to the consumer. Do they accept it right off the bat? Do they need some hand-holding? How does that work? Let's start with you, Stephen.
I think they need to see it in small dosages. And I think of, you know, during the first economy collapse, for example, orange was enormous because orange, they say, is the color of optimism. So you were starting to see it in accessories. It wasn't even so much a component on the body, but then it gradually went into clothing so that people were wearing it as more of a commitment. And then the scale of color changed, and then various items and even interiors. So now you're living with color in a much more committed kind of way.
Billy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think depending on the level of the market we're speaking of, I think for the masses in general, there's a lot of education that needs to go into accepting a certain color. I think people need to see it in editorial, people need to see it in books, they need to see it on celebrities or in art shows or on the catwalk for them to accept certain color. I think when we talk about Generation Y, for example, and younger people, they're much more likely to accept new colors at a quicker pace just because they have access to fast fashion. And they can just go and for $14.99 explore any color, and if their friends don't accept it, it's so cheap and easy to just eliminate it and move on to something else.
What do you think, Chris?
I mean, for me, I like to use a lot of color, and I think, you know, obviously people have these emotional connections with it, particularly in the retail environment where, I mean, everyone knows black is, you know, the easiest sort of sell, obviously. Right. And, you know, it is, particularly at designer level, a huge commitment for someone to invest, for example, in like a mustard yellow dress. Like, it's just a bigger thing. And I think, you know, one of the fun things that I get to do with my job and with color is introduce and educate, you know, quite literally the customer in the dressing rooms and sort of break down those barriers where, you know, a certain person hates yellow, like could never wear yellow, and then they try on a certain shade of yellow that we really like, you know, in our own collection, and then their husband says they're beautiful, like they feel beautiful, and, you know, you sort of break down those preconceived notions, which I think is a really nice thing to be able to do, to kind of complete the circle.
What do you think?
Well, I don't think the consumer really needs to be educated about a new color. I think that it's actually, and somebody said this, it's in the air. And particularly with the color pink and honeysuckle, we've seen it bubble up over the past few years. In fact, you know, we were predicting it for summer 2011. So that was almost 2.5 years ago. And, you know, we saw it coming up, we saw it in cultures, we saw it in the high end, we saw it around the world in different industries. So, and even today, you're starting to see the color on magazine covers, in retail visual merchandising. So it's just all over the place if you really sort of have an educated eye. And, you know, I remember back when chartreuse was first introduced to this society, and we had been seeing it in Europe, and it was very popular, and the Europeans loved that color, and it just was not selling over here. But the more and more it was used in fashion, it was on TV, you saw it on the internet, all of a sudden it became mainstream. So I just think because it's all around and consumers are so exposed to it, I don't think there's any particular education that a retailer has to do. I think just the idea that it's out there and it starts to just be all over the place. The consumer is wedded to that color. And you know, today you're not going to see that color go away. There's a longevity to trends these days. So, you know, it's not in and out anymore. Color is more of an evolution process. And I think these guys could attest to it, that it's not here today and gone tomorrow.
I also feel like you guys obviously know honeysuckle. I'm not sure how many of you have seen it, but that color in particular is very orange-based, sort of pink, which is sort of a new generation of that optimism, I think, in terms of kind of a new gender-neutral color in a way, because it's quite a masculine pink, actually.
Do you all think that trends like that, you know, that search for optimism and sort of light and brightness, do you think that those are cyclical? Have those, I mean, you could probably tell us, has that happened in history before where people are searching for a color to sort of lift us out of the doldrums?
Absolutely. You know, we've been researching color over the past 100 years, and it's very interesting to note that in 2 other decades, particularly the 50s, where pink was think pink. That was the mantra of the 50s. And that was representative of, you know, today it's about taking charge, but in the 50s it's about women taking charge, albeit it was in the household, but it was sort of the strength of the woman and pink, and also the idea of technology also allows you to create certain colors as well. And you know, you think about the cosmetic industry in the 50s, they were able to generate new shades of red and pink lipstick, and that became very iconic for that particular decade. And then even when you look back in the 20s, in the roaring 20s with the flapper days and their dresses, and even in interior design with upholstery and so forth, pink again was a very important color. So it's interesting when we look back and you also look at what's happening in society and culture during those times. There are some similarities.
I think especially when you look at art history, I mean, it's so clearly defined, particularly within the, from 1900 on. You're looking at very specific periods of what's going on due to changes in chemistry that certainly invent color. I read an article recently about how mauve was invented, and it was through a chemical accident. So it's things like that, you know, and it was done so recently. It was maybe about 80 years ago. So, but to see how color becomes a real cultural barometer, and why, you know, why, and not only just a particular color, but also relationships around that.
So, when you are each looking for, you know, new colors and new color palettes, when you're doing your Pantone Color of the Year, when you're designing, when you're looking for color palettes, and when you're teaching, how do you teach to look for color and look at color, you know, for someone that maybe has never done that before, and how do you come up with new color palettes and new ideas and find fresh new colors?
I think for us, we try to have the student have an experience with color. So one of our many assignments are to be within an environment where you're analyzing not only the colors themselves, but also the scales of colors and then the relationships of colors. So for example, if you're in a room, what's that percentage of that hot pink? What's the percentage of that hot red, as opposed to if it changed a scale? And then we'll have students look at collections where, you know, maybe it's a very tonal, gray-based collection. Imagine if that were done in primary colors. How's that going to change the overall effect of the overall mood? So now students are learning the psychology of color and how placement can certainly change that. And then also thinking about when you create color palettes as a designer, you know, imagine if you're on the sales floor with 10 other designers. How do you retain cohesion around all like eight or nine other designers? So again, it's not a particular color that's wrong. It's really about the relationship and how they're contained. And I think of, again, another example. We do a Gap and Banana Republic competition every year, and a student was using a very primary yellow, and he was cutting a head-to-toe yellow suit in it. And I said, it's great, maybe not for Banana Republic, but maybe they would do it as a layering piece or in a stripe or a print. So again, it's not the color itself, but rather how it's used.
What about you, Chris? When you're designing, how do you come up with new palettes?
I mean, for me, I'm totally emotional and kind of instinctual about it. I try not to think about it too much because I think when I get into the percentages and the psychology of it, it sort of strangely dilutes it for me. But and I do love the head-to-toe yellow look. I'm not gonna lie.
It's a lot of love.
But I'm always looking, and I'm, little did I know when I arrived at Parsons foundation year for the first half, I would be blocked from using any color at all.
Really?
Yeah, again.
Wow.
But now that I do have the opportunity to use many different colors, I sort of appreciate more all those sort of gradations of color, the gray-based colors, of those beiges and kind of all of that tonality. And sort of people think about color, they think of the rainbow, but when you go deeper, when you open up the Pantone kind of fan decks, you're like, oh my God, I didn't even know this weird page of gray greens existed or whatever. And going back to the relationships, putting kind of an Eve Klein blue next to some of those, more grayed out colors can make the bright color even more kind of important and relevant sort of in that contained palette. So, so for me, I'll find a weird picture in the New York Times that's been blurred out and it's on color, but it's printed on that great kind of gray newsprint, and it makes all the difference seeing it that way, and we can build an entire palette off of that. In fact, we have done that before. So,
are you inspired at all by street fashion and what people are wearing now, or do you look more,
I think so. We sort of look everywhere. I mean, our inspiration boards are sort of pieces of everything. There's really old art. There's new art. There's there's some vintage. There's kind of ideas that we were just talking about it earlier. I sort of like the idea of the practicality of clothes and how people are going to wear them. And the problem that I try to solve as a designer is really sort of reinvent things that people already have, which is kind of, it's the most charming thing to me. It's sort of give people a new navy blue blazer, even though they already have a navy blue blazer, and why is it different, and how is the color different? And, I like that kind of process and sort of building a wardrobe that way.
So, Billy, when you're coming up with new color palettes and forecasting for WGSN, where do you look? How do you come up with your research?
So as Lisa said, it's all about these concepts that are up in the air almost. I look at a lot of social and cultural shifts that are happening in our society so that I can better understand where the consumer is currently. What are they being exposed to? What are they talking about? What are they doing in their free time? So that I have a better understanding of their state of mind. That gives me more information about what they could be actually open to rejecting or accepting in the future as far as color or in general trend forecasting and trends, fashion or product trends. So for example, if people are too focused on immigration, it actually gives me information that maybe they're more open to different colors coming from different cultures. If they are staying at home and they're preserving jams and they're actually looking much more at food, it gives me more information that maybe they'll be more open to colors that come from natural colorants or from jams or from root colors or from veggie colors, you name it. So trying to understand what the consumer is being exposed to and what they dream of gives me an opportunity to go in and do much more in-depth research that I can pick colors that I know are going to appeal to them. So when it comes to the actual inspiration, as Chris said, it could be a photo in a magazine, it could be an editorial, it could be an art piece. We look at a lot of art exhibitions just because artists tend to get tired of the ordinary and the mundane much faster than anyone else does. So they jump on new concepts and on new color palettes much quicker. So I always look into artists just because they're always at the forefront of innovation, whether it's color or trends. So it could be an image that I collected from an old magazine or from a new magazine. It's just, I try to pick different images to support my initial concept and ideas.
So I'm sure everybody wants to know how Pantone comes up with their colors. And when you make an announcement like you did last week for honeysuckle, what are the steps that go into that?
Well, it's interesting, and what all these guys said is true. We come from a really interesting vantage point because while we're looking at the artistic side of color and color trends and what's new. We also have that component of science at Pantone and how to create those colors physically and chemically. You know, what's going to work, what can you actually generate? It's one thing to dream up of a color, but in real life production, you know, how are you going to generate it? So, you know, that's one aspect. I mean, we have people that call us and say, oh, can you give us more reds? Can you create more blues and khakis and whites and even the newest blacks? So that's interesting because we're developing those colors technically inside of our four walls, but also we do sit at a very interesting vantage point because we are dealing with so many different industries that use color. So our clients really span a vast variety from technology and product design and floral design and worldwide. So, you know, we could be sitting inside of Apple and get inspired by certain colors that they're doing when we're developing technologies with them. So it's really interesting where we come from, and while, you know, we go to the trade shows, we look around the world, we see all of the influences that are bubbling up in terms of cultures. You know, it's also a matter of what the consumer likes too, and we do keep our hands on the pulse of the consumer as well, so we know what they like and how certain colors make them feel. So that's just another level of information that we put all together in this pot and mix it up and come up with the color of the year.
So that's really interesting, just talking about, you know, how you always have the consumer in mind. When you're designing, when you're coming up with your color palettes, how do you make sure that you're staying true to your vision and keeping it directional and doing like your point of view, while still keeping it, you know, commercially viable and something that will actually sell?
You know, it's funny. My experience in fashion has been sort of in both of those arenas. I worked at Marc Jacobs on collection, which is sort of like, you know, you could do whatever you wanted. And then also at J. Crew, which was, I always say, sort of like my graduate school from Parsons, where it's like, you know, it was, you know, real clothes, how people wear them, how they fit in, you know, tens of thousands of units. And it becomes very clear the kinds of colors that people gravitate towards, you know, and you could literally rank the colors. Always, it didn't matter what season it was, you know, there's all these sort of rules that traditionally in merchandising sort of go into it. And for me, you know, with my collection, I sort of have to pretend like I don't know a lot of that in order to kind of make it directional in a way. You know, knowing all of those things, sometimes it becomes more difficult to design because, you know, you're apprehensive about making a head-to-toe yellow suit, for example, that may not necessarily, you know, move the needle at retail. But, you know, I think knowing those things is sort of a huge part in understanding kind of color and understanding the consumer and how, you know, how she behaves, which is, you know, obviously a huge part of selling clothes at the end of the day.
Right.
I'm curious, have you ever had to alter a color? Let's say you did it in a particular primary. Has the store come back and said, we want the color, but we want to gray it down a little?
We haven't. However, we always put like a black or a navy blue option, you know, usually on the line sheet for, you know, for stores that don't necessarily want a fuchsia or whatever we decide to sample it in.
Yeah. I mean, for every product creation group or for every collection that's based on a product, whether it's fashion or iPods or you name it, there's always quite a clear split between commercial and directional, because you need to understand your consumer and what they've been responding to prior and what they've been exposed to and what they would desire, so that you give them an easier choice where at the same time you're pushing with the other half of the collection, where you're saying, okay, I know there are innovators out there, and I want them to accept these colors so that they expose everyone else to them. It's the same when I forecast my palettes. I always need to make sure that there's a balance between the two. And the more forward colors, let's call them, could be used as lining or piping or you name it, on more traditional and more basic styles that can appeal to both the more forward and commercial clients.
And I think so much of what we're talking about is when do you use a color? So, for example, if it's being introduced in the industry through the media, whether it's a typeface or whatever, and they're just seeing lots of this particular color, but then Chris uses it after people are getting warmed up to that color in a collection, well, by that point, maybe they're more accepting to use it in clothing, as opposed to, again, maybe interiors or something else.
So commercially speaking, do you each think that color is a, you know, when we create new colors, we are feeding a need or generating something for sales? Do you think that as, you know, consumers, we're looking for constantly new things, or it's just it being pushed at us?
I think everyone wants a new color. You know, it sort of goes back to what you were saying and you know, what you just mentioned about piping and sort of how it's used. It's like, you know, it depends on the category that the color is in fashion, for example. There's not this apprehension to purchase a cashmere sweater in a bright color because, for example, cashmere takes color very beautifully as a fiber. So, you know, over however many years people have been buying cashmere sweaters, they actually sort of look for bright colors in those pieces. And I think that category, as an example, is something very interesting because we can experiment with color a lot there, and ultimately it will end up on the retail floor, which is kind of a nice thing, again, to know about how sort of the consumer behaves. There is, though, that apprehension to have the customer commit to a purchase of, you know, a fuzzy, colorful, tie-dyed fur jacket, which we've also done before. Albeit it made for a great photograph. And, you know, I think it's interesting to look at those categories, too. It's sort of like, you know, they only recently started making iPods in colors, where, you know, at the beginning it was only
black and white.
Yeah, white at the beginning. Where then the reaction to that was a black one, and, you know, that sort of thing.
Well, I think also, like, with the iPods, I mean, that is something where every time a new palette comes out, like, people just want to, you know, buy it and buy it and buy it. It really is like a constant, you know, driver. But what you were saying about sort of getting a customer to ease into a color, and maybe they'll buy a cashmere jacket or a cashmere sweater, but they won't buy, you know, a fur vest. Are there certain preconceived notions and, you know, fears that especially women have with certain colors where, as a designer, that's like a issue that you need to work through? You know, I feel like a lot of women are weird about colors, so.
I defer.
I think that, due much in part to the Color Me Beautiful book, which is why I think that I can't wear certain colors because I'm an autumn.
Will you explain what the color? Will you explain the Color Me Beautiful book for those people in the audience that don't know what that is?
Well, I don't actually know when it came out, but I remember being like 3 years old and being fascinated by it because my mom had it in paperback, of course. And I remember reading it and being like fascinated, like I had to know everything about it. And I think that it was some sort of sensation in like 70s, 80s, where everybody kind of like decided what their colors were, and that, you know, just was sort of the way it was, and I don't know that anything has ever changed with that, kind of in that age group. Like, our customer tends to be a little bit older, so I'm dealing with those women that were like conditioned by this book, and they always talk about
like, I'm a winter, or I'm a fall, or I can only wear, basically you know, blue.
I mean, the premise of the book is that it divides all people into 4 categories of sort of being either a spring color palette, like I feel like you're probably a springish, or a winter, I don't really remember. You know, and you can wear like pinks and yellows and all springtime colors, and then summer obviously is, I think, more stronger colors in that vein, like tomato.
Tomato red.
And then obviously fall, autumn, and winter, I think, is like navies and grays and all those winter colors. So I think that whatever, you probably know more about this too.
I don't want to
you can
admit
follow
to
up.
knowing
But
I do.
See, it's true. That people really are committed to the kinds of colors that they feel comfortable wearing, whether it's Color Me Beautiful or, you know, Oprah or Kathy Lee Gifford or something. But they really, I mean, they know what they want. And like I said before, it's about, it's incumbent upon designers and, you know, of all sorts, I think, to connect with the customer and be able to break down those barriers where certain people can look beautiful in gray, even if they're like a spring, according to, you know, the Color Me Beautiful manual or whatever.
Do you teach Color Me Beautiful at Parsons?
No.
Is that in the curriculum?
Lord, we were beauty school dropouts.
Yeah, but I agree. I think there are a lot of preconceived notions about what women can wear and what they cannot that have probably been broken down a little bit in the past decade. For example, purple is a great example. I remember coming from the design industry, and I remember when we were trying to push purple many, many years ago, and the business people always said, no, it has a very negative connotation in this country, it'll never fly. There was demand. There was just demand, as Lisa said, in the air for actually more of these exotic colors, of colors that maybe were not part of the women's wear palette before. Now, purple become almost a neutral. It's part of every women's wear and men's wear palette, and as Lisa said, it has such long trend life to it that women are demanding that color, but at the same time they want something new. They want the newness of something exciting, but they feel very attached to purple, for example, because it gives them comfort. It's familiar now.
Can you think of other colors where that has happened? Like at first people were very, resistant.
Well, I think we mentioned all of them: chartreuse, orange, purple.
I think army green is a good example of that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and just now they're, they used to be inventory, but now they're selling.
So I want to talk a little bit about, Billy, you touched on this a bit before, about if any of you feel like the digitalization of our world and the digital era is changing the way that people use color and view color in their daily lives, and also the way that they dress. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole world is at your fingertips, literally, virtually. So it has definitely changed the way people see color. They're seeing it in so many different applications. They're also seeing it technically in backlit color. So for some reason, it's so much more vibrant and engaging. And I think that there's much more interest in color than ever before. So I definitely think that it's a contributing factor, absolutely.
What about you, Chris? Do you agree with that?
I was going to say the same thing, going back to kind of like the iPod, and everyone's like constantly staring at their iPhone, and we're sitting in front of the computer, and I think, pre-computer, all the people could look at was sort of the television, which is like only 3 colors that make up the colors on the TV, but, or like printed, same. Well, I don't know anything about that. There's something about that. Yeah, let me just keep going. But there is that thing of having like a bright light shining, a white screen. I read like interior design blogs and design blogs all day long and every day. So, some of those can be like very well curated and very restrained in their colors, and it's sort of that more meaningful thing of having, a white background and then a tiny like red book like in the corner, and like it's a light and it's shining in your face. So I think there is something it's a very direct link, I think, with technology.
Yeah, I think what the virtual world is bringing is all these weirdness and abstraction and all this experimentation that young people are actually engaged in right now. They play with different photos put together, they do a lot of video, and this is creating new unseen color combinations, something very new and exciting that they're responding to. And I think what's interesting from my perspective is I always try to forecast, in a sense, their behavior and how is the internet going to change. And I recently read a really interesting research that was done, and they said in the next 4 years, 90% of the internet content is going to be video. And that already gives us so much information that we're going to be looking at blurred images, we're going to be looking at HD technology, we're actually going to be looking at the world from a very different perspective. So it's definitely driving product color from every aspect.
I just wanted to add one other thing, because many people, certainly the younger generation, are using color as a way of personal expression, and they're sharing everything on the internet and with their friends and so forth digitally, and they're sharing their color palettes and capturing inspirations and sharing that. So it's all over the place, and it's really an interesting practice that I think is new to this generation, that is going to increase the acceptance of color by the consumer in the long run.
I agree, and I think it just goes back to this idea that whenever you see a particular color for so many hours during the day, and you get so accustomed to seeing it, it no longer becomes this shock to you. It's no longer a surprise to you. Much the same as, I think it was Diana Vreeland who said pink is the navy of India, because to them it's all around them. And how many times have you gone away to the Caribbean or an exotic location, you come back and you just view those primary colors so differently? because they're just all around you.
So when you're teaching at Parsons, do you notice that, I mean, you have so many international students at Parsons. Do certain students have different ways of using color based on, where they grew up or their cultural background, what basically, nature that they grew up in?
I think absolutely. About a third of our students, if not more, are international, and sometimes you can just look at the projects and you know immediately where they are with how far away from the equator they are. And even from the West Coast to the East Coast, and those of us who have been to California, the lighting is just so completely different, and your relationship to nature is so completely different. And I just got back from San Francisco, and our relationship to the sky is this little sliver versus the expanses of being on the hillside. So again, I think how they grow up at such an early age and how that's imprinted into them, and the comfort level they have of using color and scale and certain types of palettes as well. Whether they're slightly more grayed out, more tonal, more urban, versus a little bit more based on nature, a little bit more graphic, a little bit louder, a little more, I don't want to say the word festive, but you know what I mean. Happy.
Do you all think that the American market is a market that reacts to change in color very well? Are they open? Are they closed? You have a very good standpoint.
Yeah, I think the American market it loves color, and they're watching pop culture and movies, and they're just more open, having dealt with the Asian market and the European market from a product development side and color development side. There's so much tradition that is steeped in those particular areas that I think they have established preferences, and it's harder for them to depart from certain preferences. And I just feel that the American market is much more open to change and newness and freshness of color.
What do you think, Chris?
Well,
you can disagree.
Well,
it's allowed.
I can only speak from my own experience, and all I know is that Japan loves anything colorful. They love individualism in fashion, which is my experience. And usually the ways that American buyers merchandise color is more specific and restrained than the ways that, or kind of the flexibility that I think the Japanese have in terms of fashion. And I mean, we all know Japanese, like in Tokyo, there's like the wildest outfits you've ever seen. And I think it goes back to all of that tradition where people really, in that culturally, love a personal identity, which also goes back to technology and street styles and all those things where, experimenting with color. What I've seen is their ability to experiment with color through fashion is quite remarkable, where like the American buyers will have an appreciation for certain things editorially more so than the Japanese in particular, that the orders will actually come for those sorts of things from the Asian markets, which is cool. This is always my favorite things.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Philly?
I think what's really interesting is, I think maybe until a few years ago, we've all heard that, oh, look at fashion in Europe is going to come back to America in 2 years. I think we're always used to hearing that inspiration will coming from somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we're looking to Asia, we're looking to Europe. I think what's been happening lately, it's really interesting. With the whole Americana movement, America is looking onto itself for inspiration. It's saying, okay, I understand what Asia is doing, I understand what Europe's doing, great for them, it works for them, but we have so much in this country that we need to explore that. So I think America is no longer looking outside for inspiration, and that's actually driving a lot of new color that's not necessarily working somewhere else. So I think it's not even about comparison. Is it more open? Is it more closed? It's very different right now. Because I think Europe is still caught up with the pastels, which in the US we explored, we moved on. We're much more interested in more vintage shades now, and actually the camel and the burgundy. So I think it's just very different in that sense of acceptance in color and what's actually offered on the market.
Do you agree with that?
I do. It's interesting because whenever I think of how regional fashion used to be, there was French fashion, Italian fashion, American fashion, British fashion, there's still a sense of that. But at the same time, I'm a little jealous of the graduates today because when I graduated, there's a sense of you must be an American designer, and if you're anything but, go to Europe. And so I worked for a designer, and we would hang next to Yohji Yamamoto, and it was frustrating because they would go to Japan and Paris and buy that. Then when they came back to us, they would just go right to the Americans. I'm saying that only because now America, everything is going on, and I really support what you said, where America is looking a little more internally insofar as they're forming their own identity that's far more global, but what am I trying to say? It's no longer having to be a particular American sensibility. And I think that speaks a lot to color, where, even 5 years ago, there was a sense of buyers being far safer in what they bought because Americans they wanted to be more homogenized. They didn't want to stand out. But I think that's going to radically change.
Hopefully.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think with a new generation of buyers, I think there'll be so many more opportunities in a sense where a lot of color would be offered on the market.
I think we're just getting more comfortable with it.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I am, and I'm so not a color person, but I'm obsessed with interior design magazines lately, and that's my trigger right now. I'm seeing all this bright color used in interiors, which is now going into my wardrobe, and I mean, not you, that you can see now, but I'm really liking and feeling comfortable with color. I feel like it is a seven-step meeting.
Yeah,
I'm comfortable with color.
I'm comfortable with color now, yeah. So what colors are inspiring you right now?
I really like Kelly Green lately. It just feels so optimistic. And so, I don't know, the older I get, the more I hate winter, so it just reminds me of spring. And I really like the bluish greens, those kind of in-between colors, and really hot pinks. I don't know why, but yeah. But green especially, I don't know why, and I'm so not a green person. But that bluish kind of a little more Kelly Green.
You're not a spring.
That's right. It's amazing how something just feels right all of a sudden, though. Yeah.
Coming back to haunt you.
What does that say about you?
Billy, what colors are inspiring you right now?
I think overall palettes that I'm looking at right now that inspire me is a lot of this vintage luxury, a lot of worn brights in a sense. The bright colors still appeal to me, but I think there's this sense of something that's aged a little bit or that's been worn a little bit. So maybe deeper purples again, or midnight blues, or maybe lighter, dustier pink, just colors that have a little more essence to them.
Okay. And Chris, what about you? What can we expect for autumn winter?
Well, I feel the opposite. We're like sort of what I was talking about before, like all those kind of like really rich beiges and taupes and even sort of to this like blonde wood color. It sort of seems really interesting to me right now. And then paired with, like, I love the idea of 3D, like all of those, like everything from like navy blue to turquoise to kind of like magenta and then to, burgundy, kind of that arc, plus all of those neutrals. So that's sort of what we're working with.
And Lisa, you don't have to say honeysuckle.
No, well, I'm blonde, so I love pink. I will admit that. But I think what's really interesting to me now, because I'm a color junkie and I'm always playing around with different colors, is those complex tones. The tones that you don't know whether it's black or it's brown or it's green. It sort of has these real complex undertones to it. It's a nightmare to design with because depending on the lighting, it could shift in different ways. But I just love those colors that are gray to mauve and at different times of the day shift. And I think that's very new and fresh and sort of organic and mineralized. And I think we may be seeing some of them sort of playing off of what you said, Billy. I think we may be seeing those in the future, but I just love the feel of that. I think it's really rich and different and grounded. So,
What's so interesting about those colors that can go so many different ways is the user almost becomes a designer, where based on how they're pairing it, it suddenly shifts a color, and then it can feel like a different garment, or just interesting.
Well, and it sort of feels like consumers are starting to embrace that a little bit more. Like they're not afraid to wear it as much. But it's interesting that you all said completely different things for what you're feeling right now. So
By the end of the season, we'll all like the same.
yeah, you'll all be
color,
wearing the exact same.
It's just because it's in between right now. We don't know what's going on.
Well, I'm going to pass the questions over to the audience now. We have a couple mics going around, so I cannot see anything, but if you can raise your hand if you have questions, and someone will bring a mic to you. And please speak in the mic because we won't be able to hear you otherwise. So I think right here. Do you want to stand up? Sure. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. It was great. You just ended with all of the things that you think are going to be in season or in trend, and all the colors that you're looking forward to. I've been trying to study sort of what are things that are not in trend, what are colors that are not in season, and taking that perspective. I think it's a little bit more complicated in the time that we're in. And I was wondering if you had any sort of perspective on that.
I think I can go with that one. I think what's really interesting, and that goes for fashion trends and for color trends, is the extended life of colors. And as Lisa said, the second we become accepting of something in society, currently, we don't let go. I mean, think of any single color that's been popular in the last 5 to 6 years, we're actually still holding on to in our wardrobe, but then we're demanding new ones. So I think what's happening is everything goes as long as you're actually styling it well and as long as you put the whole package together. I can't think of single color that I'm gonna look at and be like, no, because even pink, I thought we saw the height of pink a few years ago, but now we're going to a second height. We're actually very interested in hot pink again. So it just goes to show that we're much more accepting of the long life of colors and of trends right now. So nothing is really out of style. You look at the 70s, you look at the 20s, you look at the 90s, whether it's bright colors or the beiges or the blues or the browns, everything is accepted.
Questions, anybody? Okay, great.
Oh, we have one.
So I guess the essence of my question is, how do you get a color to be adopted? Like, what is the secret to it? I'm the colorist and textile designer for Robert Graham, and I do primarily menswear. And so men are a little bit slower to adopt colors and, to be a little bit safer about the things that I do. So I tend to introduce a new color by pairing it with older colors that they're more accepting of. But I would love to be a little bit more directional and get men to adopt colors a little bit sooner. So do you think there's a safer way to do that, or like how, what are your thoughts on that subject?
I mean, in my experience, it's something that we do that exact thing in the collection. Here's a secret for you.
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted.
I mean, well, I love mustard yellow, for example. Mustard is in almost every collection that we've ever done, but if you pair it with different things or put it with, put it next to a butter yellow, put it next to a turquoise, it ends up looking like a different thing. And it's very Parsons what I'm explaining. And I think that if you have the ability to kind of register what, a color that maybe was a little bit easier to accept, you can know, okay, well, our customer has that already in their wardrobe. Let me show that color paired with, this new color and have it sort of make sense that way. And I mean, it's better than just throwing it at the wall, I guess. But, I think it's about creating that wardrobe, like I said, to kind of establish those colors that people catch on to and then kind of build onto that. And then maybe get rid of that color that they already have for a couple seasons, then bring it back again as like, a corresponding piece or something.
I would say actually create some accessories, so have the investment be smaller, but create the accent pieces with those new colors. And then also just look at activewear, because activewear is a little bit bolder in terms of injecting new color into menswear. And for some reason, I mean, there's a lot of men bikers out there wearing pink. So, so I think that would, bring you a little more success in terms of new colors.
I think similarly to what Chris's point is maybe sometimes it's what goes around it can make it feel sometimes like a neutral. I'm just thinking of a Burberry collection from a while ago, and it was the most beautiful butter yellow, but because it was in a sea of khakis, it read as a non-color. But then you take out that yellow and you put it next to even a white, and it read so graphically.
Thanks. Okay. Other questions?
Hi.
Oh, okay, great.
Hi. So my question is, when you make an announcement like honeysuckle is the color of the year, my question is, what does that mean? Like from a consumer perspective, what does that mean? Am I going to start seeing it in cars and clothes, on home appliances? Like what does that mean?
Yeah,
what happens?
Exactly. Well, the reason that Pantone is making that announcement is really just to give consumer direction. It's not dictating that this is it and this is, what you're going to have to be wearing over the next year. But, we've found that there is a fear of color in general out there, and we are just providing direction and basically showing you, look, it's the shade of pink that's representative, so it doesn't have to be that particular honeysuckle color, but there are a lot of surrounding pinks around it, and we're saying that this is a significant color for you to look at, and you will be seeing it in fashion, in home, in cars, maybe, all kinds of accessories and so forth, and maybe you should open up your mind to try it in some way and try something new. So it's, and for the retailers, I think, they probably benefit more from it, and manufacturers can take advantage of it because it just, it's in the air, and if you have that color, you're probably going to sell some merchandise.
And can you think of a reason why that color might more or less take off? In other words, like if somebody wears it or if it's seen in, whatever place, would that be, in your experience, a trigger for this color to take off or not?
Oh, it's definitely. I mean, you're seeing it on the red carpet, you're seeing it on actresses. It happens to be a very flattering color, for your skin tone and so forth. So it really, people look great in it, men and women. So, you can't go wrong with that particular color in that respect.
Any other questions? Oh, down in the front over here.
Two more right here.
Thank you. So I have two questions. One is, how do you see political events affecting color? You talked about the United States being different and looking inwards, and we are basically affected by all the things that are happening in the world. So that's number one. Number two is I've been in the business for over 20 years, and one of my perception of color is that I've yet to see somebody really take a stand. When I see most of the trend forecasting for color, they tend to cover all areas and all possibilities. And, and I've yet to see really somebody taking a real bold stand and taking a chance. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, of course. I'll answer that question first, and then you guys can step in. In general, depending on what color forecasting company you work with, and depending on the timeline we're talking about, I think the further out you are, the more hesitant people are to point out certain colors. So I think it's much easier to look at the mood and predict the mood and say we're looking much more at bleached bright, or we're looking much more at sun bleached pastels, or whatever colors you're talking about. And then the closer you get to season and the more you see people's shift towards one color palette or another, it's much easier to actually point out and say. So I think what a lot of color forecasting companies do is they allow for their customers to take initiative. And when I say customers, I say the fashion industry. Because we try not to say it's going to be Pantone 1767, 82. We try to actually give the creativity back to our consumer, where we say, this is the mood, this is the color palette, you know your customer, you know your price points, you know your market, now go and do it. If color companies or forecasting companies always name specific colors, everything's going to look the same on the market, except for smaller designers or independent designers or designers who actually stand for themselves. But just in general, the market is going to look the same. So I get a lot of phone calls from manufacturers especially, and they say, I need to know what's the new yellow. And I always say, I reserve the right not to comment on this just because this is your job. This is what you have to do. And I come from design background, as I said, and I used to actually create Puma's color palette before any color forecasting company could actually give us information, because we were working 3 years ahead. So we had to make a decision on our own, and then the color forecasting companies gave us confirmation, essentially.
Does anyone want to tackle the first part of this question about, can you repeat it?
Political.
It was about the political.
Yeah.
What political temperatures sort of can create different color moods?
I mean, I think the honeysuckle and what Lisa said about her explanation about saying that people are actually looking for optimism all comes from the political scene in the country. People, I think, have been struggling with recession and with the government, and they lost trust in the government or president or whatever you want to name it. So now they're almost taking initiative in their own hands, and they're saying, okay, I need optimism in my life. I need something to get me through the day, because it's not going to come from up above. And this is when you see trends bubbling up. This is when people are actually starting to be creative on the street and demand more exciting colors and more exciting fashion, just to counter, I don't know, just to redeliver what they're not getting from up above, essentially.
Also, just to add, I mean, the tonality of the colors evolve too. So where last season or the year before, it might have been more sombering tones and more muted tones. Now we're seeing, because of that need for optimism, we're seeing, you know, those brighter tones, those courageous colors, because we want to get out and do something and change something. Where before, maybe we were really in the doldrums, and colors really reflected that from a tone and value standpoint too. So you'll see that as well. It's not only the hue, but also the component of that color that will change over time.
I would think so much of what you do as forecasters is just researching how do people want to feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sounds so simple, but you know, sometimes it's very slick and urban and very, you know, homogenized and discreet. Other times it's very bold and confident. Other times it's optimistic, etc. But how that maps out through history too.
No, definitely. I think a big part of it, and as I mentioned, I teach forecasting at Parsons, and that's what I always tell my students. It's about taking a step back and actually standing behind everyone else. Let them go, because everyone's so busy with their day. Just take a step back and look. Listen what your friends are telling you. Listen to what your mom and dad are telling you, because they're actually giving you all the answers. It's just we're all too busy, just moving on.
Other questions?
Yeah, I did have a question. Hi. I got to spend some time in East Africa, and after living there for a couple of years, my concept of what colors go together completely changed. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how globalization will impact the way that we look at color, specifically how maybe the South and the East would impact the North and the West rather than the other way around. So how does globalization and technology impact color and our perception of color?
I think it's just going to mean anything and everything is out there because it's all accessible.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's very easy to reach out, and I think I'm taking initiative to speak to this because this is technically my job. But I think really interesting is that you bring up Africa. And what happened is the World Cup that just happened in South Africa in 2010 brought up completely new aesthetics and colors to the TV screens of people globally. So from this perspective, globalization is actually bringing different cultures to your screen, whether it's the computer or the TV. So we saw the tribal movement, we saw all the tribal fashion as a reflection of this. And at my previous job, we started to design for World Cup 2010 the second they announced it, that it's going to be happening there. So I can tell you already people are actually designing for Brazil because they're so excited about these colors and the culture, everything that comes from Brazil. So people are already planning for it. And speaking of the East, a lot of research I've been doing lately is all this talk about religion in the Middle East is actually bringing a lot of awareness coming from the Middle East. And we hear about all the new architecture and all the new art projects coming from the Middle East, and that's actually bringing a lot of information coming from that end. So the colors of the new architecture with the different environment just brings new perspectives to all of us, and that's part of globalization. It's something you can click and see. Yeah.
Any other questions? Down here.
Hello? Okay. We're on. So in creating a concept or inspiration for both men and women, how can you cater to their emotions when, you know, women tend to be a lot more emotional or highly emotional outwardly, and men seem to kind of keep that constricted and hold that back? How do you cater to both? In color, with color. Well, yes, in design.
I only design for women, so.
Purely emotional.
Yeah. Maybe Stephen is good at the men.
Clarification? I don't know. Did it make sense?
I think, well, I'm thinking of a particular project we've done where students have designed, based on one inspiration, one fabric story, to very different markets. And it's a really great challenge because it's forcing them to think about scale of a silhouette, but also, again, scale of a color and how it's being used. So I think that's, for me, if I were doing, say, a men's and a women's line, I would be thinking about the scale of color and where it's being used. I'm thinking of a Dries Van Noten collection where he used a really bright yellow. I mean, it was almost like a chemical yellow. But he did it so that he twisted it with a gray yarn, so it was very washed out. And then when he did use it in a primary way, he was doing it in a shirting stripe or a foulard scarf stuffed into the pocket, that kind of thing. So it was more of a blip. Whereas women, I think they're possibly more apt to invest in larger pieces, more statement pieces, in addition to those other kind of core pieces, or the variations of color.
What about for a unisex line?
Well, I mean, that brings up a whole other discussion about fashion today, and I think we have menswear students, and I encourage them not to think about gender, which has to do with color. Maybe this is 20 years out, maybe it's too soon, but I think when you look at the most exciting fashion out there, such as Lanvin men's, or Hedi Slimane when he was doing Dior, and women were buying the suits. It wasn't about gender at all. It was really just about a particular lifestyle, a way clothing made you feel, which again, how does color make you feel? And I think the best designers out there are very in tune to how do people want to feel in a garment. You know, we're coming out of, maybe we're still in it, a particular time in history where people are cocooning, they want to stay at home, they just don't want to deal with crowds. So what does that say about how we dress and how we want to feel, the experiential design, if that makes sense?
And again, I think research is a big part of it in the sense that we've been reading more and more lately that more women are getting PhDs than men. There are more women becoming CEOs than men. So, and more men are staying at home being fathers or taking care of the babies. So I think you're seeing this social shift happening, and then automatically you start catering to this social shift. And I think it's really interesting that you said honeysuckle is a masculine take on pink, because again, this new woman wants to be glamorous and she wants to be beautiful, but she wants to be strong. So I think understanding the emotional connection that people have to product would actually give you answers to what colors you can offer to them.
We're noticing that charities are aligning themselves very specifically with a color, most notably breast cancer research. And we're seeing, for example, their pink showing up in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect, like Major League Baseball, where their bats are pink, or NFL, where the NFL has adopted pink cleats or pink armbands or whatever. Do you think that they're specifically doing that to invoke an emotional response that'll get people more in tune with what that charity is looking to promote? And two, why do you think they're utilizing typically sports that wouldn't necessarily adopt a pink as a spokesman for their charity?
Well, you know, just to start, the association really changed their pink, because at one point, if you remember, it was a very pale pink. very feminine, and so forth. And they changed it because they wanted it to be more about empowerment and taking control and taking charge. So now it's a much stronger pink. And you know, they've involved the men's, the sports and so forth, just to show that this is something that they want to take charge of. They don't want to be victimized, and so to speak. So that's the only thing I can think of.
Anyone else with questions?
Hi, I'm over here. So I know you all mentioned that the consumer is a little bit hesitant to take on color. Do you think that's driven by human nature, or do you think that's something that's ingrained in us at a young age? Is that a little off topic?
Sorry, I was trying to figure out where you were.
And
I wasn't
back
listening.
there.
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat that?
Would you like me to repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, you all mentioned that the consumer is hesitant to take on new colors, and I wanted to know if that was something that you think is human nature, or is that something that's ingrained in us at a young age?
I mean, I think you hit it on the head that it's so, I think that subconsciously there's very intimate relationships that people have with color.
You know, at the same time, I think there's an acceptability of color. So we're so fickle, I think.
I think there's just a lot of preconceived notions of what's masculine and what's feminine that people are not willing to let go for the most part. But then those boundaries are breaking up. So we're definitely seeing, as Lisa said, we are seeing more acceptance, but I think it'll probably take a few generations to actually see, as you said, a unisex palette or a palette that looks exactly the same for men and women. It's just because a lot of us were brought up with very strong ideas of what's masculine, what's feminine, what's accepted, what's not accepted. Even I still get it from my parents. You're not wearing that, are you? Going out. So it's just the way it is. And I always justify and say, I'm a color specialist. I know. But still, you know, it doesn't do it.
But I think one of the reasons why we're so open to color right now, and this is a fairly broad topic, but we're so hungry for an emotional trigger right now. I think, you know, with how quickly things are going, like never before in the world has things changed at such a rapid rate, and we're just kind of thrown in the middle of what's going on, and we're not feeling things like we used to. We're not taking the time to slow down like we used to. So to have something that's just kind of that very visceral reaction is so enjoyable today.
Anyone else? Yes, down here. Oh, we have time for one more. No, one more. One more.
Sorry, I hope it's good enough. So we've been talking mostly about color and its relationship to culture, and I wanted to know how you feel about color and its relationship to social economic classes, because there's this huge difference now between jobless and the luxury market, and I wanted to know if you ever saw a color where it was very successful in the luxury market and it just wasn't in the mass market, and any comments with regards to that.
I think a lot of the non-color, if we call it, and what I mean by non-color is exactly this combination between colors. Like honeysuckle, I think if I had to show you what honeysuckle is exactly the combination of our two dresses. It's this pink, bright pink
it's
and
right
red
there.
mix. Yes, right there. So for the longest time, I think we've seen the more conservative customers not to accept colors in between, not to accept non-colors. They always said, if it's going to be red, it's got to be red. If it's going to be pink, it has to be pink. Nothing in between, because that confused them. So I think this is a perfect example of something that the more forward customers saw it as an opportunity to differentiate themselves and say, okay, I'm going to combine these two and I'm going to stand out. Where the more conservative customers always took a step back and said, no, if it's going to be red, it's going to be red.
So I think that's all the time we have tonight. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Let's thank our panelists.